Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Yusuf Aram. 3 days, 3 capitals, and more than 24 deals. Turkish President Erdogan's Gulf tour was less ceremony and more diplomatic show of force. From Kuwait to Qatar and Oman, he oversaw the signing of 24 agreements, even as Gaza and the occupied territories dominated the agenda. That tour also coincided with the Israeli parliament's initial approval to annex the occupied West Bank. The move triggered wide Arab condemnation and even criticism from its main ally, the U.S. 15 countries, including Turkey and Kuwait, issued a joint statement condemning Israel's annexation plan. They also welcomed the International Court of Justice's ruling that rebuked Tel Aviv's Gaza-aid restrictions and settlement legalization. Erdogan's Gulf tour began in Kuwait, where maritime transport, energy, and investment pacts were inked. In Doha, the agenda shifted to defense industry cooperation as Ankara deepened its strategic partnership with Qatar. And in Muscat, Turkey signed wide-ranging deals on mining, defense, higher education, media, and visa liberalization with Oman. But as Turkey deepens its Gulf ties, can Ankara's outreach translate into a new balance of power across the Middle East? For more, joining me now from Rome is Maria Luisa Fantapi. She's the head of the Mediterranean, Middle East, and Africa program at the Institute of International Affairs. From Ankara, assistant professor at Ankara University, Betül Doğan Akkaş, and from Doha, Ali Bakir, who's an assistant professor at Qatar University. Gentlemen, ladies, thanks for joining me. I mean, before this 3-country bilateral visit, there was a very crowded backdrop, a very complicated backdrop, obviously, with everything that's happening in Gaza, with the ceasefire deal at Sharm el-Sheikh, the UNGA. So there's been a lot of diplomacy amongst the Arab world, but a lot of diplomacy between the West and the Arab world as well. Maria, I want to begin with you. How important was that backdrop during this 3-country visit for Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan?
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be on the show again. And well, as you were saying, we are at a very crucial time. I think that it's very important that this visit of President Erdogan actually happens after the ceasefire agreement on Gaza. I think that part of what it's happening is that Turkey crucial role into the finalization of the Gaza ceasefire, it's somehow also elevating Turkey's geopolitical role across the Arab world and in the region. This is why this visit is both about Gaza, but also it's about, in some way, reaffirming and boosting Turkey's geopolitical standing through economic ties, but also through the political clout that Turkey has in making sure that the Gaza ceasefires continues.
Mm-hmm. So, Betül, Maria is saying this trip was both a bilateral trip, but also about wider regional issues. I mean, if you had to break down the amount of that these conversations were held, whether it's bilateral issues or Gaza in the wider region, what do you think was higher on the agenda? What was talked about more? And how important was that these leaders got together to be able to resolve those issues?
Thank you, Yusuf, and I totally agree with my colleague from Rome. I think I can answer in 2 ways. First of all, Turkey-Gulf relations is critical, of course, for their bilateral ties. They do have agreements on several topics, including defense, economy, politics. But what brings them together, other than their joint interest in terms of their bilateral ties, is also the wider insecurity embedded in Middle East politics. At this stage, it's more about to bring an alternative hegemonic formation, an alternative hegemonic narrative to Middle East insecurity, which is actually dominated by Israeli attacks in Gaza, in Syria. So the insecurity embedded in the region is somehow has to be reconstructed by other Middle East countries. And I think this is how Turkey and Gulf are trying to revisit their relations. In this regard, the agreements they have done in Kuwait, in Doha, in and Oman, they have all a shared understanding of increasing defense ties, having more military training and defense agreements, plus boosting the economic cooperation, which can actually relate their trust and confidence in foreign policy making to have a wider and secure Middle Eastern understanding designed by the other actors of Middle East rather than Israeli insecurity recently unfortunately dominating the field.
Yeah, I totally agree with you because, I mean, regional security probably very high on the agenda, and the amount of defense deals that were signed show and support that regional security was probably topping the agenda. Now, Ali, before this three-country trip, we saw Saudi Arabia sign a defense pact with Pakistan. We saw the Qataris renew or revise their defense pact with the Americans as well. Is this a new trend, these bilateral defense pacts, or is this kind of a journey or the first steps towards a more regional security umbrella that could be built in the future, as the Egyptian foreign minister had previously proposed at the Doha summit about a month ago?
Thank you very much, dear Yusuf, for hosting me. Answering your question, let me first highlight that this visit was pre-scheduled way before some of the most recent developments. Of course, the Turkish side seized the opportunity not only to discuss bilateral relations, but also to try to find multilateral platforms to join forces to work on the most critical regional security issues. Now, concerning your question, I think that there is a trend in the region to diversify both on the sectoral and regional level. And this trend actually started like 15 years ago. It aligns with the regional and international dynamics, especially the diffusion of power on the international arena, and also the shift of power and wealth from the west to the east. And in this sense, this trend of diversification, which aims to boost the independent foreign policy decisions of the regional countries as well as their strategic autonomy, also aims to create a space for maneuvering between the competing regional and international powers. Turkey and the Gulf states play a crucial role in this sense. We have seen Turkey diversifying its especially security and economic ties away from the West, as well as the Gulf countries who most recently tried to do the same, opening up towards Turkey, establishing military bases, hosting Turkish troops, signing defense industry and knowledge production, knowledge transfer, cooperation agreements with the Turkish sides, trying to cooperate and coordinate on the military and security level and on regional issues in Syria, in Gaza, in Palestine, in Somalia, in Yemen, and elsewhere. So I think that this trend is not new, but it's here to stay given the regional and international dynamics. And I think that both sides realize that there is their need to cooperate and work closely on this level.
Mm-hmm. Maria, right in the middle of Erdogan's trip to the Gulf, the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, gave the go-ahead for a West Bank annexation. Now, just a week or so ago, you had the Sharm el-Sheikh Gaza ceasefire. Now you have a West Bank annexation or a possible initiative there. I mean, if you're Muslim leaders and you're looking at this complete contrast, I mean, ceasefire in Gaza, whether it'll hold, it might not hold, that, I mean, obviously that remains to be seen, but now you have kind of a go-ahead for a West Bank annexation. How frustrating is that? And how should the West look at these types of policies?
I mean, it's, as you describe it, it's a very fragile moment, because on the one hand, we sort of like have contradictory signals. On the one hand, we have the Trump administration celebrating the downing of the new Middle East and the new Middle East peace. On the other hand, we have the Knesset voting for on the de facto annexation of the West Bank. So it's very unclear actually whether we are on the cusp of a peace or on the verge of a continued medium low intensity confrontation, which resettles the regional order. As for the way in which the West see this, I think that what I can bring from a sort of a European capital perspective is that there is a lot of hope that the Trump agreement, although not perfect, it actually could be the beginning of the end of the hostilities in Gaza. There is also a lot of interest on trying to understand how the 20-point plans of Donald Trump could in some way be steers towards actually having and bringing in the Palestinian Authority in a more decisive way, because we know that the text does not actually include a mention of a two-state solution. So from a European perspective, and specifically also from an Italian perspective, there is a lot of wish to actually in some way also see a long-lasting, durable peace, and that obviously cannot come without actually the also creation of and the recognition of Palestinian sovereignty. So the European perspective is really to try to work as much as possible with regional players, including Turkey, but also Egypt, Jordan, and in particular Gulf states, to try to advance in some way what can be a durable peace, and therefore bringing in also Palestinian authorities as much as possible into the picture, and keeping in some way the ceasefire holding. In this, Turkey and Qatar have a very important role, and we know that Israel is actually looking with suspicion on how much actually these two players, Qatar and Turkey, are committed to the disarmament to helping the disarmament of Hamas. So I think on this the West doesn't have a lot of stake, but it's one of the most crucial nodes of this 20-point plans, which, if not implemented, risk really to jeopardize the entire agreement.
Bitul, the Turks and the Qataris, they were both at Sharm el-Sheikh. The Emir and President Erdogan both signed the declaration over there. They were up on stage with President Sisi and President Trump as well. So both of them very, very invested in the ceasefire. Now, there was this expectation that there'd be a stabilization force, with the Turks playing a role in that stabilization force. But it seems that the Israelis are trying to roll that expectation back, that the Turks won't be there. How important is it for some type of Turkish force, some type of Turkish troops to be in Gaza, not only for the Palestinians, but also for regional countries to know that the Turks are there on the ground?
So in any conflict resolution cases where we have tremendous amount of effort done by the parties, and where we have quite problematic social situations as we have in Gaza, we have to have a side which might be supported by, a peace side, a group to invest in the local community in terms of security arrangements, humanitarian aid, as you mentioned, the educational support for the society. So we need a party who can actually manage the humanitarian aid and also manage the peace process, which has to be somehow bridging between Israeli and Palestinian parts, plus international parties. So in this respect, we have an internationally backed group of states, not only one, but maybe more than one. Turkey has a specific role in it because the foreign policy making of Turkey has always been invested in the Palestinian situation. It is something that Turkish government is heavily prioritizing in their foreign policy making, and it is somehow they can actually engage with their full potential in terms of diplomacy, cooperating with Qatar, even with the Israel, of course. But the problem, as you mentioned, the understanding of the current situation and promised deal between the parties is not going with the way agreed just a couple of weeks ago in Egypt. In this regard, I believe the international organizations and maybe more support from US to help to ease a Turkish role in Gaza, because this is something local community is looking for. They have to see the parties back them during the genocide, not only a completely unfamiliar countries to Palestinian cause. So Qatar and Turkey has a specific role in this, maybe including Kuwait and Saudi peace, not troops, but peace organizations. And Turkey has been already like kind of operating its role. They have a specific ambassador now focusing on humanitarian aid in Gaza. He is already in the field conveying the international support and Turkish aid to Gaza. So Turkey has been already doing this from its side. How they can manage with other party that is trying to put more obstacles to have third parties involved. This is something we have to bring more international organizations and actors, because we have to have a surveillance in Gaza. We have to see what's happening. As we have seen since the 7th of October, even before, we can never rely on Israeli information. What they provide so far may not be the real case in the field. And this is why we have to have international organizations like we have in West Bank and Nablus. We have to see what they need, how they are proceeding with the humanitarian aid or any other peace situation, the reconstruction of Gaza, all these insecurity problems in the society. We have gangs trying to dominate the certain neighborhoods. So we have international actors in the field. We need them to support local community. And this is where we will have another diplomatic clash with Israel to ease the situation, as they promised with the previous summit in your question.
Ali, when we talk about regional security in the Gulf generally, I mean, the number one country that comes to mind as a threat traditionally was Iran. But it seems that lately Israel might be making a run for that title as being the country that could be considered the biggest threat. I mean, when you look at the Gulf from a country by country perspective, who's the biggest threat? And also from a security guarantee perspective, is America still the preferred security provider, or is a country like Turkey now moving into that role, or Pakistan, or maybe a China in the future?
Well, as you know, the U.S. for so long has been the primary and sole security guarantor of the Gulf countries, and this status of the U.S. have been eroded during the last 2 decades, and the Gulf countries are seeing that these guarantees are not as strong as they were, and also the U.S. is turning into unpredictable player in terms of the security role in the Gulf, and this is posing a lot of challenges and threats to the Gulf countries, coupled with, of course, the traditional and usual Iranian threat. But due to the Israeli-Iranian rivalry in the last few years, Iran's position, role, and power also have been eroded, which made it less threatening to the Gulf countries. This is, of course, also was happening in parallel with the efforts of some Gulf countries to normalize relations with Iran, which also, in a way or another, evaded Iran's threatening role. I'm talking specifically about Saudi Arabia and the UAE in this regard. Of course, within this context, Turkish player has evolved as a security player in the Gulf since 2014 and practically since 2017, which witnessed the blockade against Qatar. And this blockade, of course, accelerated the Turkish security and military role in the Gulf for the first time since around 100 years, when the Ottomans withdrew from the region. And since then, of course, Turkey has been strengthening its security and military and defense role in the Gulf. Most recently, some Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE realized how important to cooperate with Turkey in terms of defense industry cooperation, and also in terms of knowledge transition and knowledge transfer and knowledge production. And that's why, for example, Turkey emerged in the last couple of years as the second biggest arms exporter to UAE. This is a significant shift considering the tensions that two countries witnessed in the last decade. Also, Turkey is expanding its defense industry base in the Gulf. With Saudi Arabia, there are joint defense cooperation agreements with UAE, with Qatar. Turkey is a military ally since 2014, and now Turkey is focusing more on Kuwait and Oman. There have been rumors in the last few years that Oman is considering a naval base for Turkey in its maritime borders, but this is something to be considered. I think that the latest visit for President Erdogan, which was historic to Oman, is opening a new path for the Turkish-Omani relations in terms of politics, economics, and of course military and defense. So all in all, I think that the Turkish role is increasing security and military-wise, not only in the Gulf, by the way, it's in the region and far beyond. You have now a Turkish role to achieve security and stability in the Gulf, in the Sham area, in the Middle East, in Somalia, in North Africa, in Libya, in Caucasus, in Azerbaijan, and there are also other roles to be considered. For example, in the future in Ukraine, there is already a role for Turkey in Balkans, and this role is expanding due to the of course, the decline in the U.S. power on the one hand, and also the lack of credible, reliable, and powerful countries who are ready to act in such situations. So Turkey emerged as a unique player, and that's why we are seeing this kind of role is expanding with the agreement, of course, of these regional countries. This is not an easy task to be achieved, and you will always have those who challenge you or try to undermine you. And this is where the focus will be on Israel in the next phase. And this is what the Israelis are doing exactly right now in Gaza, trying to undermine any potential Turkish role in terms of security and military in Gaza. This is something, of course, to be seen how it will be developed. But I think that there is a strong saying for the U.S. in this regard. If it really wants to move forward with its agreement, the ceasefire, and the next phase of this agreement, then pressure should be applied on Israel to not to undermine any Turkish or regional law for the Gulf countries, Egypt or Turkey.
Mm-hmm. Maria, I want to ask you about the bilateral relationships during this three-country tour. Obviously, 24 deals signed in 3 countries over 3 days, quite impressive. When we look at the competition for this region, whether it is the United States, China, Russia, the EU, trying to vie for the attention, vie for these contracts, and you have Turkey now, can Turkey be very competitive in this region? Can it become a preferred economic partner, a preferred trading partner, a preferred manufacturing partner on a wide scale of many issues, and also a preferred hub for Gulf investment as well? Does it have that capacity and attractiveness?
Well, while not being an economist, neither an expert on defense industries, it's very difficult for me to give an accurate answer. But what I can say from a really geopolitical perspective, it's that there is quite of a, let me say, absurd situation whereby Israel Israel fears an increased economic and geopolitical weight of Turkey in the region. And Israel fears also the spreading of a certain type of political Islam model that they attach to Turkey. And then at the same time, the fact that actually Israel has launched an attack on Hamas members in Qatar has been a turning point that has facilitated in some way Turkey to have bilateral defense agreements with specific Gulf countries, which after the Israeli attack on Qatar, look for boosting their defense industry. So there is quite of a controversial situation where on the one hand, there is a fear from Israel of a Turkey increased role, but Israel's own attack has actually facilitated Turkey in expanding these bilateral ties. I also wanted to elaborate on how these three countries, in some way, like Qatar, Kuwait, and Oman, are also the countries that in some way are less inclined compared to other members of the GCC, especially Bahrain and UAE, who we know they are signatories of the Abraham Accord. These other three GCC members, actually, that Turkey has visited, are those ones who are less inclined to actually subscribe to a normalization without a firm two-state solution. So beside actually the clear economic and defense element of this trip, there is also, I think, an important political dimension that sees an ambition from Turkey in some way of gathering some members of the GCC and convening with them, especially and tying relationship with them through economic and defense ties, but also through under the same umbrella of the same geopolitical objective of pushing back against normalization without a two-state solution.
Well, it's definitely an important three-day, three-country trip, 24 deals signed, as I said. We are out of time. Maria, Bitul, Ali, thanks for joining me. Thanks for helping me unpack this important trip. And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Yusuf Aram. If you got any comments, please share them with us on X at Straight Talk TRT. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can find more exclusive content. Until next time, take care and goodbye.